Good Tuesday morning to you. As you saw in the announcements, we're stepping back a little bit from daily devotionals, and we are doing it Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. This week, I'd like to focus on what Epiphany is. Here we celebrate the season of Epiphany. We do this as the baptism of Jesus begins, and the actual date of Epiphany is always January 6th. So sometimes that falls on a Sunday, and sometimes that falls during the middle of the week. This year it was on a Thursday. The date, January 6th, is when we celebrate the wise men coming. So today, tomorrow, and Thursday, I want to talk about those two stories that frame out Epiphany, and then what Epiphany means for us and our lives. So today, we begin with the traditional understanding of Epiphany. The old church, the ancient church, talked about Epiphany being on 12th night. So after the 12 days of Christmas, that night is when they celebrated the wise men coming. Of course, we love our nativity scenes with the wise men. I like to get a little literal with my nativity scene. I like to tuck the wise men behind the nativity or put them off a little bit away from Jesus, because we know that because of Scripture, because of how Scripture is written, the wise men really don't show up 12 days later. It's actually probably closer to almost 2 years later that the wise men show up to bring homage to Jesus. And I'm going to give some examples of why we know that to be true, and also where the tradition of the wise men come from. So you know the gospel text, the wise men are only found in the Gospel of Matthew. That's significant because Matthew is a Jew writing to Jews, and this is part of the Jewish tradition. Wise men, Magi, astrologers are sometimes the interpretation. This is part of an extended Jewish understanding. It's a sect that studies the skies and the stars and connects what is happening in the world with the ancient text. And so they were not separate. They weren't like a sorcerer. They weren't separate from the religious order, but in fact an extension of the religious order. And we hear this text in Matthew 2. So let me just read you Matthew 2 so we remember what we're talking about. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes, calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for it has been written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, and by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is shepherd to my people.'" So this is the invitation that Jesus is to be born in Bethlehem. It's an important text that we read often throughout the Christmas season. The wise men come, and then they encounter Herod. From one kingdom to another, they come to the order, to the kingdom, to ask permission to travel across the land. This is a very important text because we still do this today, right? If you're hiking, you make sure you have permission to be on those grounds. You stay on the trails. If there's an easement, for instance, Shelburne Falls, I think they've redone it now, but when I first moved here, Shelburne Falls had an easement with a farm, and you had to stay on the trail. Otherwise, you had to ask permission of the farmer to travel his land. The same is true with the wise men. They had to ask permission of the king in charge to be able to travel the land. Now here's where it gets a little interesting. In verse 7, Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring word to me so that I also may go and pay him homage." When they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star as they had seen its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. Now, I'm going to pause there. So a couple things happen here that's actually really fascinating. First, the wise men come to King Herod, and we read that King Herod is actually frightened. That's not a poor translation of the Greek that's in the text. King Herod is actually concerned with this entourage of wise men. We like to assess that there's 3, but there's probably at least 12, maybe even more. Because to travel a significant distance, you always had to have a grouping of people. It's why families join together, and you could have 30 to 60 family members coming from Nazareth to Jerusalem to the Passover. And this is true for the wise men who likely came from Persia or some of the Near East or the Far East that we might think about in today's terms. Arabia is another country that's often talked about. In the 8th century, the church established this rule that the wise men actually paid homage to 3 nations. Belshazzar was part of Arabia, or sometimes Ethiopia gets thrown in there. Melkar is the king of Persia, and Caspar, the other name that is associated with the wise men, is the king of India. So we have this confluence of all of these exotic lands coming into Israel, coming to see Herod. And with them and all that they come with, Herod is concerned. Is this an invasion, right? This is why he's frightened. And that's why the gospel text writer actually includes, not only is he frightened, but all of Jerusalem is frightened. Because there's this fear that this king is bringing about another exile, which is an important thing that we have to remember when we read this text. And the other detail that's worth noting, like I started with, is that Magi were an extension of sects of Judaism, of studies within Judaism. And if you want to find out how that matters, you have to go all the way back to 2nd Daniel. Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 3, and you actually have this encounter. It's believed that the prophet Daniel is a Magi, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are also Magi. In fact, in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar wants to kill all the Magi because they are not able to interpret his dream. And they say, well, that's not really our job. We're not dream interpreters. We're star watchers. We're sign enthusiasts. And Nebuchadnezzar becomes very angry, and Daniel steps in. They send word for Daniel, and Daniel says, I can't do this because I'm a Magi, but through the Lord Almighty, then I can interpret your dream. And because King Nebuchadnezzar appreciates what Daniel can do for him in that moment, he actually spares the Magi, and he puts Daniel in charge in the high court. And Daniel then appoints Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be in the outer skirts, the Babylon, the Persia, the outside, to do their work as Magi. Of course, they'll get themselves into trouble in Daniel chapter 3. You can go back and review that a little bit. It's a great story of how God protects us and cares for us when we are called to be bold and courageous and stand against the wrongness that exists in this world. But back to the Magi here, that's why in this gospel text from Matthew, the Magi are part of the story, because they've been part of the narrative of God's story for a really long time. Now, like I said, the 8th century church gives them actual names: Caspar, Balthazar, and Melkor. If you were on social media last Thursday, I had a little tag on my Facebook post that I do every year. It said 20 plus C plus M plus B plus 22. The ancient church used to chalk that above every doorway entering into a home. It was thought to be an Epiphany blessing, that God's presence had come in the form of gifts. And so it was a blessing, praying for gifts from the Lord for that year. It's the year 2022, and then the initials of the ancient wise men that it's given to. So Herod fears what this could mean. He fears his own position of power. And so he sends the Magi on, and he calls them back. Now in verse 10 we read, when they saw the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy, and on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Now, if you remember, Mary and Joseph are in Bethlehem because of the census that Caesar Augustus had decreed all who needed to be registered. It is not just today that it seems like the government takes a long time to do things. That apparently has been happening since the early time of Christ's birth. And it would seem that they're still there in Bethlehem. We read that they've moved out of the stable. They're now in a home. Mary is with the child. It doesn't say an infant. There's nothing about a manger and swaddling cloths. That's why we believe that between 0 and 2, this is when the Magi come. And if the Magi really are coming from Babylon and Persia, which is where Magi tended to reside, we're talking like 1,400 miles. So it would have taken them a while. You could easily, within a day's travel, you could walk about 10 miles, 15 if you're pushing it. So if you think about how many days that included, the Magi, it took them a while to come. And they found the child with his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. And then they opened these treasure boxes. They offer him, Jesus, the gifts of a king: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This is what you brought. You brought multiple boxes of gold and frankincense, which is an incense. Now, myrrh is a fascinating gift to give a king because not all kings were given myrrh. Myrrh is only used in the preparation of death. And so usually that was kind of one of those gifts that maybe the awkward person brought, that, wasn't necessarily common to bring a king something that would remind him of his termness in his leadership. But they bring Jesus gifts of riches of this world, spices to add that scent and that he will be anointed with later, and then myrrh in preparation for his death. And then they receive a dream. Now remember, I told you back in Daniel, the reason Daniel saves all the Magi is because Magi didn't interpret dreams. But in the Gospel of Matthew, they receive a clear word. That's how we know that there's a connection to the ancient faith. They receive a word from God. Do not return to Herod, but go to your own country by your own way. Of course, the saddest of the story is that Herod becomes enraged, figuring out that the Magi have tricked him. They have gone back. They have not reported who this king might be and where this king might be. And so we have the story of the slaughter of the innocents, which happens in verse 16 on in the chapter 2 of Matthew. Herod calls that all the baby boys 2 and under should be slaughtered. So thankfully, Zechariah protects John. Jesus and his family now have the means to flee to Egypt with the gold that has been given to them. And so they flee to Egypt and they protect Jesus. And Herod soon later dies. And thankfully, he is out of the picture. This is Epiphany. The story of the wise men coming is a reminder of how God knit together the story. The wise men are not an obscure, crazy element to the details that it's like, wow, God, you just had to add a little extra flavor. It's like when you're cooking and that spice that doesn't belong, but you want to be exotic. You throw it in there. That's not what's happening here. God connected the story all the way back to Daniel of how God would order all things, and that even the things that seemed in the broadness of how we understand God at work, things like astrology and some of the sciences that shows that God is in the midst of them. It's an example of how God doesn't just work through a very narrow indication of what you're called to do. God works in the broadness. This is Martin Luther's desire to teach on vocation. Each and every one of us, in the role that we are called to live, have the opportunity to serve. So if you are a pastor, that opportunity is probably pretty clear, or hopefully it should be pretty clear. But if you're a teacher, if you're a scientist, if you're a doctor, if you are working in finances, whatever your role might be, maybe you're sitting in an office listening to this, or maybe you're still at home, maybe you're retired, or maybe your call has been to keep the home moving forward. God is working in and through you and has an incredible purpose for you. That's the beginning of Epiphany, is to know that each and every character that appears in the story of Jesus, that is connected to Jesus, is yet another example of how God is at work in this world. And if that's true for scriptures, that's true for your life and mine as well. Hope you have a great Tuesday. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the second story of Epiphany, that of the baptism of Jesus. Have a great day.